here. I'm Zhan. And today we're going to be talking about the mathematical modeling of thin sheets, as the title says. This is a very niche but interesting subject in math, or applied math, and I'm very excited to share with you what we've learned today. This talk is going to be split up into 4 sections. We're going to start with motivation, why should you care, what even is a thin sheet, all that good stuff. Then we're going to talk about model setup, like initial good properties of the model. In this section, we'll also talk about model validation. Why does this mathematical object work in real life? How do we do that with math? Then we're going to talk about initialization. We're going to talk about what we put into the computer to make it more accurate to real life. And then lastly, we'll talk about that dynamics of the system. Something cool about this is that it's very physics-based. And so we're going to talk about how everything is based off of Newtonian mechanics. And then we'll show you some results after that. It'll be cool. I'm excited. So I'm going to start out here with some motivation behind why we're doing this. I'll split this up into 3 motivating questions. Why do we want to simulate? Why do we want to simulate thin sheets specifically? And what is the model? What exactly are we doing? So first I want to talk about why simulation. Simulation, of course, is like putting something on a computer, doing something like that. Anyways, the reason why we want to simulate, I don't know, does anyone here, have you worked in a lab before, something like that? Does anyone want to raise their hand and tell me? I don't. How much does lab equipment cost, stuff like that?
Hella bread.
A lot, right? No, but basically, even if you just take an intro chemistry, for example, there's a ton of materials, ton of stuff like that. What simulation allows us to do is do a ton of experiments without getting all that material. No, and so that's really helpful. That's why we want to simulate. There's also different microscopic scientific discoveries we can make using simulation. For example, we talk about in this model about energies of certain atomic level nodes. That's something you wouldn't be able to measure in experiment very easily. Also, in our current world of machine learning and using machine learning to drive future scientific discovery, we can use data we have, put it into models, and then make the models much better for future data science-based research. And that's something really important from simulation. This is why we want to simulate, and this is a key topic in applied math. Next, I want to talk about thin sheets. Why do we care about thin sheets? Plain and simply, there's thin sheets everywhere. I'm holding a paper right now, stuff like that. But yeah, there's also, I have on the slide graphene. I have on the slide a car. In general, vehicles, when they crash, when we study the crashes and stuff like that happens, we call it a crumple zone, and crumpling is inherently a property of thin sheets. I forgot to define what a thin sheet is. A thin sheet will be an object in 3D space that is way bigger in 2 dimensions than it is in the 3rd dimension. So we have width and height of the sheet, but we have no depth whatsoever. So that's what a thin sheet will be. That's what we're talking about here. To finish off these applications, there's also Earth's crust. Earth's crust has been modeled by a ton of thin sheets layering up. And then to shout out, our graduate student mentor is currently studying leaf crinkling. Basically, what she does is crinkled leaves. She uses these simulations to reverse the crinkling, and from that you can tell about different different effects that CO2 emissions have had on the leaves. But you need to uncrinkle them in order to do that. So that's something really cool. It's a real scientific application of that. But yeah. Before we move on, I want to define 3 types of sheets. There's elastic sheets, which is hold on a sec. Trust me. Basically, my sweater is something you'd consider an elastic sheet. It's basically, I'm stretching it or bending it, but as you see, if I let go, it returns to normal. There's no what we'll call irreversible damage, no permanent damage. That's what an elastic sheet is. A plastic sheet is, I try to find one in the room, but I guess I can't. I guess you could consider those paper cups, they used to be paper that you curled them, and it's now basically, okay, let me just simplify with the plastic on the screen there. Basically you bend it and it doesn't go back to normal, the opposite of elastic. And then of course, elastoplastic will be this paper, where this paper, I'm of course bending it. It's cool, but if I crumple it, it will have this permanent damage to it. And you see that at rest, it will contain these crinkles. And that's what elastoplastic is defined by. That's what an elastoplastic sheet is. And so next, to end off the motivation, I do want to talk about what this model is. Basically, two research scientists, Madeline Relien-Bruggen, Jovana Androvic. Madeline right now is a science communicator working with Hank Green, if you know her. That's really cool. No, like 2 degrees of separation for Hank Green, if you know him. And then Jovana is also currently a research scientist for CLO Fashion. These 2 women in STEM, if you take nothing away from here, stories of women in STEM are really important. Remember that. If you take that, basically these 2 wrote the papers that were like that conceptualized this model we're talking about. So we got a computational model of twisted elastic ribbons. And we also have simulation of crumpled sheets via alternating quasi-static and dynamic representations. These are the 2 papers our talk is mainly based off of. And these women worked with Chris Rycroft, current associate chair of the Department of Mathematics here, to create these papers and these models. And so we're going to talk about them, talk about why this model called the mass spring model is really cool. And let's get started, shall we?
So next, we're going to discuss about the model setup. I'll break into 2 parts. The first part is the mesh construction, which is what is the theoretical accurate thin sheets, and how is our simulation work. And the second part is how is our simulated thin sheets approach and converge to the theoretically accurate model. So first, you have to discuss about the mesh construction. So we call this whole paper a mesh. And on the right-hand side, you can see that it is the theoretically accurate and continuous thin sheets that we want to model. But in our case, you can see we break it into small triangles, which is called triangular lattice. And the reason of doing that is because it's very computationally efficient and cheap. So we want to break it into the triangular small lattice to sort of approaching and converging to the ideally continuous case. So next is our mass spring models. It is how we construct our triangular lattice. And the 2 main, we use different kinds of forces for applying to these triangular lattice models. And we can see the 2 main forces are, the first one is the spring force, which we can imagine that the edge of each triangle we treat as a spring. And when there is any displacement of the edge, we apply forces to it, just like how we stretch and compressing the strings. And the second part is the bending energy, which is if we bend to triangular lattice, there's going to be some energy applied to it. And next is our energy model. Just before we talk about how we're going to apply our energy. And in this case, we introduced the 2 main energy models that we use and reference from other paper. The first one is the Sun and Nielsen model, and the second one is the modified Van Gilder model. And to be simple, the key difference between these 2 models is Sun and Nielsen model, they treat every triangular lattice have the same, they apply the same energy to all triangular lattice, regardless of the weighted area of the lattice. And the MVG, the modified Van Gilder model, they apply energy to triangular lattice weighted by the area of the lattice. And why is that important? Because we stimulate 3 different lattice types. The first one is the regular mesh, and the second and third type is purely random and hybrid regular random. And the difference between those, as we can see, is that you can see the paper on the left, each triangular lattice, they have the same area. So it's each node on the lattice is placing orderly. So the area of each triangular lattice is the same. And in order to approaching to a more realistic crumpling and stimulating, we have to randomize the order of the node. And that's why we use sort of the purely random model and the hyper regular random model in this case. And we can see on the right, the node of the random models are placing pretty randomly. So the size of each triangle is they have different is different. And so in the first regular model, we use the Zhan model because the energy because all of the triangle lattice have the same size, so we can apply the same model that applies the same energy to all the triangular lattice. But that becomes one of the limitations when we randomize the size of the triangular lattice, and that's why we introduced the NVG, which then applies to the hybrid regular random model that applies different energy to the triangular lattice depends on the area of the lattice. So first, let's dive into the stretching in-plane energy, which is, as we've discussed, we treat every edge as a spring in the model, and if there's any displacement, we apply energy to it. And the key term right here is the spring displacement. As we can see on the Zhan and Nelson model, they apply 1 minus xi minus xj in the spring displacement because originally they treat every node, the spacing is 1, and xi minus xj is the node of the two nodes location after the stimulation. So, and it's different in the modified Van Gelder model because they treat every node spacing differently. So we can see they use Sij instead of 1 as the displacement in here. And secondly, we can see the Zhan and Nelson model, they did not have any, the Ks right here is a constant, and in the modified Van Gelder model here, they use the weighted area to modify the energy, and the A bar is the ideally equilateral triangle area, and the A naught is the current area of the triangle. And as we can see, if there's any displacement for simple stretching, we're applying forces to the spring, and which is the edge. And if there's any compression, we also apply forces to the edge. And next, we're discussing bending energy. The key idea here is they use the normal vector that's poking out of the triangular lattice to modify as a key component of the bending here, and which this term is a sort of the pseudo function that measures the angle, which is the theta here, of the two triangle. And if there's any angle changes, we can measure and apply forces to those two triangular lattice. Oh yeah, sure. And okay. And here we can see the KB is still a constant in the Zhan and Nelson model. And as the previous case, the modified Van Gelder model, they use A naught over A bar that modify the forces applied to each triangular lattice based on the weighted area of the lattice. And next, we have to discuss how is our model validated and if it's accurately approaching to the theoretical continuous case. So here is our error measurement, is how we measure the error. And the key term right here is the position of the knot. Xi is the position of our knot in the discrete triangular lattice mesh, and the XIH is the theoretically accurate position of the knot and where the knot should be, and this is just a displacement of that. And then we fit the error into the order of accuracy, and this is just the standard computational math measurement of the order of accuracy, and E is the error, of course, node, and D is knot spacing, which is the space between two knots, and B is the order of accuracy. And finally, we can see that they apply 4 different tests for energy they're applying to the mesh, and but they all have pretty much the same results. As you can see, as the knot spacing decreases, the y bar, which is the error, also decreases, and the relationship between those two is very linear. So they yield a pretty good results that it's a first order and nice first order convergence of the model to the theoretical in sheets.
Thanks, Peter and Avery. So after we setting up the model and validating it, how can we initialize this kind of mesh as we discussed above? So firstly, as we discussed above, we have set up a model called MSM, and since it aims to capture the bending and stretching behaviors of the materials, it is quite important to create this kind of mesh and to well initialize it. So how to initialize a mesh? This is an example of our method. So we first define the volumes of geometry points, just as the x1, x2 here, and we define them on the 2D domain, and it is kind of a distance relationship here, and we call the collection of the Voronoi cells to form the Voronoi tessellation. And okay, so after we have the Voronoi tessellation, we have the Lloyd algorithm. So people familiar with the data science may familiar with this algorithm. We first seek the domain with n randomly placed nodes. So we will introduce random here to, as we discussed above, to capture the different meshes, and we compute and regularize the tessellation here. So we can see that the iteration 2 and the iteration 1, we have more uniform nodes, just as the red nodes here. And we do more iterations, and it finally converges to a final version of our tessellation. And we just connect the nodes with with nodes where when they share the same edges, and we compute the triangulation here. So this is an example of the Lloyd's algorithm and the triangulation, but it's uniformly placed but not randomly placed. So just a reminder. So back to our randomly placed nodes. Once we have a high quality triangle, we can construct our MSM model on each triangle, just like this. Each triangle here.
Okay. Now that we've established a ton of different mathematical techniques to make sure our model model represents real life in a very good way, I do want to talk about now how physics-based this model is, and how basically what the computer simulations you see on screen are just solving a ton of classical physics equations in order to get the position of all these nodes. So yeah, it's all classical physics. I don't know how many of you have taken physics 1, but F equals ma, Newton's second law. This is essentially what we're doing to all these nodes. We apply forces to them, that accelerates the forces, you integrate those forces in order to get velocity and position. And so, yeah, we'll be doing that to all these nodes. Another physics concept that if you want to like understand what we're doing, force is the gradient or 3D derivative of potential energy. So this is going to be used in our notation a bit, so you can keep that in mind. Now time for a big freaking equation. So this is the force on one node I, and you have to apply all these forces to that node in order to create an accurate model representation. I'll be going through each of these one by one, defining them, explaining, but yeah, let's get started. So the first one is stretching. We established stretching and bending earlier, but basically we have this energy. I mentioned force is the gradient or 3D derivative of energy here. And so basically we do that to this, and we are able to represent the stretching of a thin sheet using that. We also talked about earlier bending energy, and so yeah, that's the out of plane elasticity. It's like, but we model bending energy. That force is the bending force is modeled by the gradient of this energy, and that's what allows us to properly model bending. We mentioned bending before, but something I do want to mention to make our simulations more realistic. We already talked about how like there's normal bending. Something we haven't mentioned in this presentation yet that I mentioned earlier, if you recall, I talked about plastic and elastoplastic sheets, which allow for coupling, right? But basically the way we're able to introduce this mathematically, we add this coefficient or this variable to the bending energy equation called plasticity right here. What plasticity allows us to do is basically, it's a function of like the angle a node has been bent already. There's like 5 other equations relating to it. But basically, it'll maintain, with this like function, it'll maintain a memory of how the paper's been bent, and that will incorporate this permanent damage to the thin sheet. So that's how we model plasticity in our model. Back to the forces, we have to make sure, so if I hit my paper here, you see that it returns to normal. And that's how it works. Like real pendulums that swing forever don't typically exist, or at least this isn't a pendulum. And so the reason for this is that we have internal damping forces which stop our paper from moving to make it a real physical system. The term we use is like dissipative forces. But basically we introduce an isotropic drag force, that's this one. You can think of this as like a piston also on the edges of the triangle, which will dampen the motion of the spring until it stops. So this allows us to stop a paper from moving or stretching. And then we also have internal damping. This is what allows the rest state of the paper to be flat instead of bending upward. And so basically you can think of it as like this sort of 2 vectors like pushing it to the side. But yeah, this equation models internal damping, and it allows us to keep the paper flat. Then we also have to talk about repulsion. So of course a sheet in real life can't cross itself. And the way we model this, in computer science generally, there's 2 ways to model this with physics engines. You can either use conservation of angular momentum and like and you like move, or like you guess teleported, I guess, like into a proper position that's not self-contact using conservation of angular momentum. And then the problem with that is it's like a lower order of accuracy than using this repulsive force. So instead what we do is when it gets within a certain radius, like when a node is within this radius or distance from another node, this force will automatically apply. And what we do with that force, it will apply the force, and then it repulses, right? And so the nodes will suddenly come apart, or like be pushed apart due to this repulsive force. So yeah, there's that. And that's a good summary of forces in the mesh. One thing I haven't talked about is external. I think external is kind of like, external, what basically it is like, of course I have the flat sheet. The flat sheet is just all of these forces, right? When we introduce this external, that's when I'm bending it physically. That's when I'm crumpling. physically. That's what this external is. And so that's the summary of all of the forces that are applied, of course, to each individual node. I guess I should specify this n sub I is like, it's the sum of all the neighboring nodes, because stretching is based off neighboring nodes. This is the sum of all the nodes in the mesh with the same normal vector. That's whatever, like, yeah, no. Okay, but anyways, I've gotten through these forces. Now I'm gonna take a bit of an aside before we show you the results and talk about an actual applied math thing instead of just some physics here. I want to talk about this last thing. It was in the title of the second paper we talked about. There's like different formulations we use in order to create the most accurate model of real life possible. So basically, these formulations are called quasi-static and dynamic. Quasi-static, if you recall from physics, is like, so it's static means the net forces on a node is zero. That'll generally be like, we say quasi because it's like, we approximate it to be zero. It's not exactly zero, but that's what quasi-static is. And basically, most of the movement on a thin sheet is going to be this acceleration or force is generally zero. I'm just moving it. But when that when a node gets past a certain reference acceleration we define with the spring constant, we switch to a dynamic regime. And so basically, yeah, this allows us to get a higher order of accuracy. The real like simulation difference between these regimes, why we want to differentiate, is like we use different kind of ODE solvers when we switch from quasi-static to dynamic, and that's what allows us to get such an accurate simulation with this model of thin sheets. And so now, now that I've covered that, I want to talk about results. Yeah, so this is the first thing. This is twisting. Of course, you can twist. My sweater is a better example. You can like twist this, and you'll see there's like little like buckles here, and it's like that's what's modeled to you. But basically, this is what happens when you computer simulate the model and then animate it with C++. Yeah, no, you achieve these twisting. I think it's pretty cool. I think it's, yeah, this is real life phenomena you can describe with this, which is awesome, right? Real physics is able to get us to get to here. That's cool. The next thing I want to talk about is crumpling. Crumpling. I'm gonna do this one more time because it's fun. Crumpling is when you have these permanent creases in the paper or in the thin sheet, right? And this is like really important to research. This is really important to everything. Because we've created such an accurate model, we're able to use crumpling that's used in real research when we simulate real things. I'll once again shout out my graduate student mentors research, working with this to reverse crumpling in plants. And that's like, yeah, that's a really cool result we have. This is a real aspect of a thin sheet. Okay, so that was what we wanted to talk about. Conclusively, I'll just go over, or we will go over some of the talk. I started by motivating it. Why do we care about simulation? Because experiments are hard and expensive. Why do we care about thin sheets? Because thin sheets are everywhere and they're a cool structure. And then, yeah, I talked about, or I guess I introduced the model as, yeah, it's a big part of research related to this university.
And then after that, I also discussed about how we set up the model and how is our discrete case model have a very nice first order of convergence to the theoretical continuous model.
Yeah, and I introduced how can we apply the MSN model, MSN onto our triangles and how to initialize such a mesh.
Yeah, so basically, yeah, to close, I just want to say modeling like this is what's at the heart of applied mathematics. This is why we do what we do. We create these models in hopes that scientists can use them to create good, or like to make good, deep, meaningful scientific discovery using the modern age of computing and stuff. And I think it's really cool. These thin sheets will be used everywhere and are being used everywhere. If you guys are more interested, you can come talk to one of us after the talk, or I guess our graduate student mentor. But yeah, thin sheets, modeling. We also have a section for questions if anyone has any. I don't know if anyone does have any, but the floor is open.
guess actually I had a question to start off with. So, and this might be beyond the scope of what you talked about, but is there any like sort of fractal kind of behavior that happens? Like as you're crumpling something, I'm imagining, right? Like,
It's
you have
like,
big ones
'cause
and little ones. Like,
fractals are inherently chaotic is the thing, but there's no chaos involved in what we're doing. I don't know if there's like bifurcations to talk about, like, I just said bifurcations to talk about like when it twists or something. Maybe there is, I haven't talked about it, but like inherently, like if there's a thin sheet fractal, I mean, I guess you could code something like that, but like generally we talked about actually, I guess repulsive forces, like, well, that's not like fractal stuff. I'm trying to go back to also, we talked about this looks like fractal stuff, but it's not random. Well, I guess the sheet is random, is the thing, right? Like these aren't, like, to clarify, these aren't the sheet necessarily. Our sheet is more randomized. The triangles are more random. So we use the Delaunay triangulation, but it's like more randomized, so it represents real life better. So there's probably some fractal where you could do with like the randomness, but it's generally not a chaotic system, so I don't know.
Are you asking if there's like some degree of reproducibility?
or like just I don't know. It seems like the kind of thing where you have like some multi-scale behavior as you like keep crumpling something, like maybe for instance. So I don't know to the extent that that's true, or as a kind of vague question.
I guess maybe related is like the importance of using that hybrid regular random measure. Let's start with a totally randomly seeded sheet and then regularize it with voice sampling. The purpose is that if you do use a totally regular measure, you'll get like increasing the edges of the triangle, hexagonal, these structures, which I guess is maybe fractal-ish, but I don't know.
Any other questions?
How much are you limited by like compute? Were you guys limited by a lot or?
Okay, this is something, so
Real
we,
quick, do not point laser pointers at people. Do not do that under any circumstances. That shit can really damage someone's eyes.
What fitting on my eye? So we're good. Go ahead.
we were talking about, so computing limitations. I'm pretty sure this is like, I don't recall if I talked about this in the talk necessarily. We talked about, there's like different models for thin sheets. I think to overcome certain computing limitations, we use, or it's like there's different models. And generally another model with finite element analysis is used for better computing capabilities. We like this model though because it follows Newtonian physics, which is something cool that we wanted to point out here. So it's like, if there are computing limitations, we'd like to, it's like you generally use other models, but this model is based off physics, which is cool. So yeah.
Out of curiosity, how old is this model? Like, how long has this simulation been available?
Like simulation, it's like this work done, or our two research papers were definitely published more recently, like definitely like after the 2010s. Like studying thin sheets has been something that's been studied for a really long time. There's stuff about Earth's crust that dates back to 1960, stuff like that. What this talk is based off is generally new, like definitely like the students were doing their PhDs during the 2010s, so like, yeah.
So, just to clarify, the Sung-Nelson model, which is just a collection of triangles with in-plane springs and out-of-plane bending springs, that paper, that model was published in 1988, and then these two papers on twisting of elastic ribbons and crumpling of sheets, like the simulations were, those were made in like 2022, 2022, so really recent.
Any other questions?
How much are you limited by? Like, how long can this simulation last? 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 Like, how long can
would someone use this compared to like you mentioned like FEA?
Well, it's
Because I know a lot of engineers in my group use FEA to model like how much force it takes to like I don't know destroy their part and like
It's-
see how it crumples and stuff or like.
the best part about this model is that it's like, I mean, I keep talking about it's Newtonian physics, but it's also like, or did you say it's like cheap?
It's very efficient in this sense.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's why this paper is very good because we stimulate different like small triangles compared to continuous case. So computationally, it's a lot more efficient and cheap, basically.
There are limitations though, like Peter mentioned that you only achieve like first order accuracy, which is pretty low. But it does the job for like moving on.
Can you run this on like a laptop? Like
Yeah,
what?
yeah, I think these simulation, I think some of it is parallelized, but I think like a full crumple simulation could maybe a day. Smaller sheets take like, 15 minutes.
Any other questions? Well, let's thank the speakers again. And we'll have a short break here. The talks, we have two more, they're gonna get started at 5:15.